I would like to recognise the traditional custodians of the land on which I am privileged to be recording this vodcast today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I would like to recognise their elders past, present and emerging. Hello everybody and welcome back to The Growth Distillery. Today I'm joined by Andrew Therkelson, Managing Director at the Lab Strategy. So Andrew has spent almost 25 years understanding human and consumer behaviour and helping brands convert that insight into action. And today, Andrew and I are talking about the business of being good and why that is so critical for brands right now. Welcome to the show, Andrew. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we're here talking about, I know, a topic that is a passion of both of ours,
Yes.
And something close to both of our hearts. The forces of good. A massive project that the two of us have undertaken. And I think, let's start at the very beginning. How did the forces of good come about?
Yes, a massive project, certainly something that, as you said, close to both of our hearts. And it kind of came about because of that to some extent. You know, this is a passion area for us at the lab. And I think back in 2018, it was probably pre-pandemic, we were picking up on a change in temperature, let's say, in Australia. It was rapidly evolving towards a conversation that we hadn't seen as much scale and emphasis around in the past, which was about businesses changing fundamentally the way that they operate. And within that, many different facets of how they change, but essentially around this topic of good and goodness. And we've been tracking Australians and Australian values and Australian-ness, let's say, for over a decade. And in the Australia project, we saw all of these signals starting to sort of spike up, right? So it was an ever-increasing number of people saying businesses need to be doing good. They need to be sort of accentuating and leaning into their values. They need to have a value system. They need to be changing the way that they operate sort of fundamentally. And it was exponentially kind of changing at that point. So between actually then and now, things have moved on even more. We have sort of 84% of Australians saying that they expect businesses to hold themselves to account around issues of goodness. 2/3 of people say that they will no longer use a brand if it's not doing good. So we saw this sort of significant shift. We started a sort of an always-on listening program as well around about that time called Lab AI, which picks up on thousands of conversations that happen around all sorts of different topics. And what we saw there was that the way that people talked about brands and goodness, let's say, or sustainability or ESG, was not equally distributed. Some brands were getting a really high share of amplification and share of voice around the subject, and other brands were sort of fading into the background. So we're like, this is interesting, right? This is something we need to unpick and decode. And it felt like those that had a wider, more open aperture around what good was were somehow stealing the hearts and minds of Australians. So that was where the forces came into play, and we started to think about, well, there's forces at play here around good, and let's understand what they are, what's important to Australians, and then what brands can do and need to do to be part of this movement that we all know is kind of happening. And then obviously in the last year or two, when we were talking about the programme, you were visibly excited about it, I think, and
it's on brand.
It was great. It was on brand, exactly, and since then we've really turbocharged it right together and created, I think, the most comprehensive, biggest, richest corpus of knowledge about this subject that exists in Australia.
So, just a quick word on pedigree before we dive into the so whats and do whats. How did we go about, and how do you go about understanding a topic that's so nuanced and textured in the minds of Australian consumers?
Well, from a research perspective, this is a tricky topic, right? Because we all know there is a intention, behaviour, action gap when it comes to these types of topics. People often overclaim what they're doing, what they would like to do, and they often think that it's someone else's issue deep down, right? On top of that, the stratification of the stratification of intention is really wide, and motivation. So we have some people who sit really far away from wanting to do anything and behaving in any way. In fact, they sort of say that there's no good behaviours in their life in the way that we categorise it. And there's others that are doing absolutely everything. So we needed a really robust programme. Firstly, we needed something really comprehensive. We also needed something that ensured we got to the depth of all of these different cohorts of Australians. We need to triangulate different research methodologies as well. So, we obviously had our social listening program through Lab AI, which tracked like nearly 1 million conversations over time to see how those conversations were growing in importance or fading away, to sort of see where the trajectories lay. We did a massive piece of quant research as well to see what the perceptions were amongst Australians and start to segment Australians into different typologies and characters. We did some deep qualitative research as well, little group discussions, Instagram immersions, where we were getting down into the actual behaviours and nitty-gritty of what people actually do when it comes to the topic. So came at it from numerous different angles. In total, about seven different research kind of modules that we've done. Hot off the press, the latest one is a huge choice model. I'd say one of the biggest choice models that exists on this topic. As we get into an era where the choices and the decisions that people are making, the trade-offs that they're making, are increasingly difficult, right? Between being good and saving money, or buying in bulk, or getting the thing that I love, the passion that I have. All of those things are minutely complex in people's minds. So we needed a really wide and rich, robust methodology to do that. So in essence, I think we've now achieved Australia's biggest and richest repository of knowledge and insights about this topic. And I would stand by the methodology. Absolutely.
As would I. All right, then, convince me. Why should businesses care about good?
Well, as I said in the preamble, things have fundamentally shifted. We're not talking about small incremental changes towards, people slightly changing their habits. We're actually talking about an exponential change, something that's happening. I would probably put it in the same camp as AI, the sort of recent just explosion, and everyone said, we need to be across this almost a little bit too late. The same thing is happening with this. We've seen it coming, of course. Businesses know that purpose is really important, and we know that we need to be doing better. We need to be doing more. Often have ESG policies. We have our goals. All of those sorts of things is of course on the radar. But the scale and the change and the nature of the change and how distributed that is now across different types of people in Australia is absolutely poignant, I suppose. So we're seeing this hockey stick kind of change in attitudes. I think secondly, Gen Z, it's a ticket to have a conversation with them, let alone, actually get them to buy your brand or believe in you in some way. It's fundamental to them. And when you think about the spending power that cohort has, $360 billion globally spending every year, just to be able to approach them and have them on your side, we need to be taking good absolutely seriously. We also went about trying to measure that a little bit more substantially, because a lot of brand models as they exist right now don't properly include the contribution that good makes to brand. So we actually reinvented that and made sure we had a nicely nuanced way of measuring how much good matters to brands. Different across categories, different across brands, we've measured it, but in aggregate, in average, it's roughly 10% of brand value, right? Which is pretty huge.
Yeah, I was going to say that might sound insignificant, but relative to, let's say, supermarkets, for example. Yep. So we measured
grocery and all of the different contributing factors of goodness. And loyalty schemes is about 10% of brand value as well. When you consider the amount of dollars and money and investment and time and energy that is put into the entire loyalty ecosystem being equivalent to matters of good, you can imagine dollar for dollar investment, good is absolutely going to return back
on that
to value.
invested effort.
Return on invested effort is absolutely huge. So yeah, we believe that this is the fundamental issue for businesses to get their heads around and get right now for the next decade.
And you mentioned ESG for a second, and I think one of the things that constantly frustrates me is that we conflate the good that's required of businesses, or the good that's expected of businesses, to be a green policy, right? If I've got an ESG, if I've got a sustainability policy, tick, I'm good, or I'm as good as I'm expected to from my customers. But this work shows that is meaningfully different from the good that consumers expect corporations and businesses to do.
Yes, exactly. Completely right. And I think it was one of the things that we picked up in those early signals was that a lot of the conversations were fairly narrow around this idea of sustainability, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Of course, it's a big issue to customers, and it's probably the most present thing mentally that they can default to and have a bias towards. But what we found was that actually the more businesses and brands and companies and governments, in fact, talked across a number of different elements of good, the more share of hearts and minds and attention they actually got from their customers, the more purpose they felt that they were actually doing. And it seems to be very easy to just funnel back into this sort of sustainability. We have to get sustainability right, and it's actually quite a narrow definition. So the forces model was what we really created to understand what else is happening. What are the other elements that are going to contribute up to this sense of goodness that you get from a brand. And it does seem like there is this conflation, like you said, that sort of happens between everything else. It all gets bucketed into sustainability. And I think that's really our big message, is to just think broader than that.
All right. Well, before I ask us to go deep into the seven forces, you mentioned this hockey stick. That we have seen an accelerated rate of change around the expectations in consumers' minds around good. Why is good becoming so much more important than ever?
Well, we've had a few interesting episodes in the world over the last few years. Climate whiplash, from the fires through to the droughts, through to sort of where we are now today, facing down the sort of the abyss. No one's untouched by that, right? So that is an immediate kind of very present, omnipresent sort of feeling for a lot of people. But more broadly, thinking about the pandemic, the P word, that had a chasmic kind of, or cataclysmic effect on the way that people think about what we need to be doing as brands and businesses, because we started to understand a little bit more about our place in society and opened our eyes a little bit wider than the sort of the me, I suppose, to this ecosystem that we are all part of: people, communities, nature, the world, government, family. They all came into this sort of kaleidoscopic focus for people. And you know what? Actually, it's really important for us to be together and do something for the world, for each other. And that makes me feel good. It makes me feel like I've achieved something, and sort of going up the Maslowian hierarchy a bit. So it had this almost lightning rod sort of effect on Australians and their attitudes. And that has catalysed this hockey stick upwards, I think. And so no matter who you are, what you believe in, it's fundamentally a bigger part of your identity now, and good in some ways, than it was 5 years ago. And once that's instilled, it doesn't really go away. It just keeps growing and growing and growing. There's headwinds, of course, which we'll talk about, which sort of knock people around a little bit. But we've sort of got a core system now that I think is really important. Yeah,
I think we've all recognised the fragility of that ecosystem that you mentioned. Our relationship to our community, our relationship to where we live, our relationship to the environment. And I think if nothing else, we aren't taking for granted the privilege of that ecosystem being in balance.
That's a nice way of putting it. Yeah, it's something that we probably felt like in the past we had, and that reflection is enough for us to say that's not the right way to live. We can't take this for granted anymore. We have to be more purposeful in the way that we choose, we make decisions, we live our lives, and I expect that from brands, from governments, from businesses as well.
Okay, so what does good look like in the minds of Australians?
So our model of good incorporates 7 different forces. They're what we would say mutually exclusive and collectively exhausted. So we have seriously litigated this model to the nth degree to make sure that it is absolutely all of the different forces of good that people care about. I'll go into them all in a second, but the main headline, as I said before, is that only thinking green, only thinking about sustainability is missing nearly all of this model. So we measured actually the percentage of good that people attribute to each of the forces that they want to see businesses doing. And sustainability is 25%.
Wow. So if you're only thinking green, you are missing 75% of what Australians think good looks like.
Good looks like, and of the rest of the good that they expect you to be doing.
I see. So as you said, that is a very, very narrow aperture for a lot of businesses that are conflating the two.
Yeah. And community is another force, for example, which I think is around about 10%. So even if you're thinking about how you're placing the community, you're thinking about your sustainability policies, you're still missing out on a large part of the model. So the others were people. So actually in our original model, we had community and people together. But as we went through the research, we realized that they're quite fundamentally different dynamics, really. The way that you treat your people as a business, the way that your people perform and what they say about you from an internal perspective is quite different to your outgoing impact that you have on communities. So people and community are 2 different things. We've got product and how your product behaves and comes across in a sort of good, in a sense of good. Privacy and data came up, for people that no matter what business you're in, there's an expectation that you're doing something to help around this topic of technology and data and privacy.
And so I presume data, particularly at the moment, is one that would have been very topical.
Very topical, and certainly one that's likely to grow.
So we've got sustainability, people, community, product, data and privacy.
Ethics.
Yep.
The next one actually was 18%, so a relatively big force. And that's about the way you behave and your value system, right, as a company, and your leadership came up, in ethics as well. And the last one's supply chain. We've seen this a lot from the qual work, people talking to us about, I get what I see on the packaging, I get what I see in the headlines, but where does that end? Is it just the sort of the headline, or what's happening down the supply chain? I want to know whether your factories are green powered energy, or whether, where it comes from makes a difference, and what the practices are in that country, for example, or how much water or electricity you're using, or how much transport costs. All of those things are actually starting to be more top of mind for people rather than just taking it on face value. So, the supply chain, locally produced, ethically sourced, and having good relationships with your suppliers is something that people now care about and will judge you on.
And so I'd love you to talk through the nuance or the texture, across generations, because surely what good looks like isn't the same for everybody.
Yes, it's not the same for everybody, that's for sure. And I think one of the really interesting things about this project and our ability together to go so deep was that we could isolate different elements and understand across the forces, well, what does that mean for Gen Z or a boomer, for example? Or what does that mean for the fashion industry? Or what does that mean for super? So we were able to work out whether or not there's a sort of a consistent application of the forces that's required, or whether you're better off sort of tweaking that graphic equalizer for generations and for industry. So yeah, as we sort of restack those forces by generation, quite a different picture emerges. So I'll start with Gen Z, for example, because sustainability is always the biggest force. Like, I have to say that. I'm not saying that we sort of forget about that. It has to be fundamental, and to our plans. But ethics, for example, was bigger for Gen Z than sustainability, which I found really interesting, right? And a generation that is powered by their values, care deeply about things, don't care so much about other things, about things that maybe in the past were more important to previous generations. Care about leadership, will be scrutinizing what you do and how you do it, and all of those things.
The institutions.
Yeah, exactly. The institutions. Product, though, comparatively small compared to all of the generations. Gen X product was by far and away the second biggest force, right? So what that told us was that by generation we have slightly different distribution of the forces, and what your secondary force is often spikes. So if you understand that combination at least, what's your primary force, what's your secondary force, and then obviously the nuance within that, you've got a much better way of being able to target different generations and actually hold them on board and then get your message.
And to talk to the good that they really want you to do.
They really want you to do, exactly, yeah.
And then I guess same question, but in terms of industry, I can imagine that when I'm purchasing a fashion item relative to when I'm purchasing something in consumer electronics, or if I'm looking for, a financial services provider, the good that I look for in those different industries or categories also differs, even though I'm the same generation.
Exactly, yeah. So we took some archetypal industries. So fashion we looked into quite deeply because it's that sort of example of quite quick turnover purchase cycle, and super at the other end of the spectrum, for example, it's not something that you change very often. Quite different. So for example, for super, community is actually really, really surprisingly low. Whereas for grocery, for example, community is the second force. And you think about the role that grocery plays in our society, it's kind of not really surprising. For fashion, it was people. And again, the dominant sort of narrative around fashion is that there's a problem with people somewhere in the supply chain, right? What was interesting was that we also triangulated. One of our components of the research was expert interviews. We did about 20 expert interviews across a range of different industries, and there was some real differences actually between what our audience are talking about and what our experts were talking about. So in fashion, we spoke to this wonderful person who had spent their life in fashion and now moved into a sort of sustainability role. And whereas our consumers were really worried about ethics to some extent and labeling, and they were worried about people and labour practices, our expert was talking about water and the way that 10% or 20% of the world's wastewater is actually through fashion. The fact that a lot of our clothes are made overseas. She mentioned Bangladesh, for example. They come to Australia and then they get shipped back to Bangladesh to be disposed of. That cycle is just incredibly damaging. But yet it's not something that everybody talks about or knows about at the moment. So we're sort of trying to triangulate the things that people care about, but with also the things that we know are important to the world, and creating a bit of a pathway really for brands and businesses. Yeah,
this was one of the things that I found most fascinating when we were doing the expert interviews, that just how different the conversations were when we were talking to consumers about the good that they expected, and when we were talking to industry experts around the good that kept them up at night. And it wasn't just the topics from memory that looked so different. It was also the nature of the conversation. And so I'd love to get your perspective. What's the conversation that we're seeing around good?
Well, if we take community, for example,
Yep.
It's a really fast-growing space. As I said before, people are post-pandemic coming into a place where we're not really understanding our place within community, but we know that it's really important. We're questioning what local now means. We're questioning what Australian now means. We're questioning the roots and the ties that really bind us to others. So we've seen that in the social data. So we've created these kind of scatter plots of the conversation across all the different 7 forces, and then sort of going down multiple levels. But in community, for example, you can see that local as a topic, buying local, being part of local communities, supporting local events is increasingly important to people, putting roots down and sort of trying to create a better sense of place than they might have had before. We've sort of seen movement across all of the different 7 forces in terms of what people care about and what's kind of growing and what's receding, and that's something we're tracking ongoing.
Yeah, so I assume not all conversations are created equal in terms of sentiment and intensity of conversation.
Yeah, that's right. So we've got volume as a key kind of indicator of where things are going and what's important to people through volume. But what we also have is what we call amplification. So likes and shares and clicks and sort of repeatable behaviours around some of that content. And you can see quite different emphasis, I suppose, if you just take out volume. And you can start to see, well, these are like the embers in the fire. These are the types of topics that are starting to gain traction. I mean, EVs came up, as an obvious example, but there's a number of different topics that are sort of sitting there that are ready to explode.
Were there any that surprised you in terms of those that really bubbled to the surface above the waterline?
Well, look, I think in the sustainability force, what I loved to see actually was this connection to nature being slightly reframed. So, Australians have always had a really close connection with the outdoors, I suppose, but it was often seen as our playground, somewhere that we can just go and enjoy. Now it's something that we can be part of. It gives back to us in the way that we need to give back to it. So this quite soulful, really intelligent way of thinking about how we commune with nature. It was a really big topic and one that seems to be really growing as well, bringing in ancient wisdom, to really be considerate about our relationship with nature. And the growth and the solace that we can get from that, people are really appreciating. And it's kind of taking form in, the health and well-being study that we did with you guys recently. You can see aspects of it having tendrils into lots of different other elements of people's lives.
One, I think for me, the one that really stuck out was in ethics. Top 3 conversations was around ethical leadership. And I think that for me is a stark spotlight onto the role that business decision makers and in particular executive leaders play and just how much scrutiny they are going to be put under, especially by Gen Z in terms of the role that they play in directing corporations towards doing and being good. I want to go back just quickly to a comment you made earlier, because I think that this is a really important point to touch on, which is around the difference in conversation, right? And that customers we're speaking different languages, that customers aren't hearing us. And so if customers aren't hearing us and shouting louder isn't the answer, how then should businesses go about talking to the good that they do?
Yeah, great question. And one that we're still grappling with, honestly, because I feel like this is quite a complex space and topic. Because on the one hand, we know from consumers that they want to know more about what all brands and businesses are doing, and they're confused. They don't really know what's happening. They don't have a very clear picture that anyone's doing well. That's not fair to say, but they're not really sure if there's enough happening, and that then doesn't catalyse their own desires and their own behaviours to do more good as well. So it was very clear from the research across all the different points that people want to know more about the subject, but confusion, different aspects of information delivery are getting in the way. The information's too confusing, the information's too dense, the information doesn't make sense, the information sounds like it's not true, it's greenwashing, it's false, and that's creating this sort of sense of disbelief, certainly in the first instance, but also just shutting down. You know, I don't really believe it. I don't understand it. It's all too complicated. You haven't made it easy and accessible for me. Therefore, I'm just not going to get involved in the debate. When I do get involved in the debate, it then feels scary and difficult and hard to process. And so fundamentally, at a sort of a human psychological level, I just don't want to be part of that. So there's a lot of work, I think, to be done to get this right and to decode what the right way forward is for brands. We've got a few sort of starting principles, but you know, getting it right and cutting through and having a great conversation with customers has to be one of the priorities, because it seemed to us that it's too easy to either not say anything and just go dark and say, well, look, we can't say anything until we've got this absolutely right, otherwise we'll get shut down, or saying too much in the wrong way that then overwhelms. So there's a little bit of a sweet spot that we kind of have to hit.
All right. Well, I want to touch on two of those things. So broad principles, and you mentioned this sweet spot. What would be the broad principles to most effectively talk to good?
Well, we know that it is a world that's pretty fraught with hazard, you know, and I don't want to make that sound like it's it's a reason to not lean into communication. But I do know from a lot of the CMOs that we spoke to in the research that there's a lot of worry about saying the wrong thing, about actually doing things that, you know, within the world of good that customers then just say they'll pay for, but they won't. You know, they've got other priorities, and then you're left stranded, high and dry. So, you know, that balance is really important. But, you know, the communication of good is one thing, but there's fundamentals behind that are super important. We have to be putting in the work in the first place.
Yeah, it goes without saying.
It goes without saying, right? We have to be putting in the work. There's tonality around our own brand as well that we need to really amplify and accentuate within good. You don't have to be a different type of brand to be talking about the good that you do. You have to bake it into all of your brand and comms. So, you know, considering your own tone of voice is super important there. But yeah, we came up with about 5 different principles that we feel are important that I can go through.
Yeah, I'd love to hear them.
Okay. Well, I think I talked very briefly about the sweet spot, and we analysed probably 100,000 messages from brands across Australia. So we really looked quite deeply at what was being said and what was getting traction, what was getting cut through, and what wasn't. And that was how we then started to look at some of these principles. And what we noticed right off the bat was that there was a lot of polarization in tone. So you'd have really, really positive style messages coming out. You know, this is something that we can do together. Come on, guys. You know, sort of galvanizing call to arms, yeah, which you can imagine sort of makes sense. But a lot of people just sort of blank that out. Unfortunately, it feels too saccharine. It feels too positive. You know, people are living in a world where I'm trying to make ends meet. I'm trying to make decisions day to day. I'm trying to get my kids through school. You know, all of the things that I need to do. To have this really, really overly optimistic, positive tone doesn't really fit in with real life.
Tone deaf.
It's tone deaf. Yeah, exactly right. So then you try the other way. You go, okay, well, let's catastrophize it, right? Let's make it super negative, and that will galvanize action. That will get people, you know, wanting to buy into our brand too. But obviously that has the opposite effect. You know, people just lean out. They have the sort of the behavioral science of loss aversion. So there is a bit of a sweet spot. It does err towards the more optimistic. People tend to be able to process messages around this subject if it is optimistic. But it has to feel realistic, you know, and so erring on the side of absolute honesty, you know, from the heart, this is what we've been doing, this is how it's working, this is what we want you to do or be involved in. Honest, warm and frank is the sort of tonal sweet spot.
But not a caricature of either positive or negative sentiment.
Exactly right, yeah. A couple of other things that we felt were really important. And the first one I think is probably the most important about a conversation. Right, and we've characterised it as having the conversation at the water cooler, which feels a little bit sort of pre-COVID, but you know, I'm sure everyone gets the idea. It's it's much easier for people to understand the debate if it's in their language and in their sort of rhetoric, and that they're asked to participate in it in some way, as opposed to it being a parent to child or this kind of hierarchical message that sometimes it can feel like from our analysis. It can also feel quite distant from them. A lot of sustainability messaging in particular talks about goals elsewhere. You know, we're going to be hitting these types of climate agendas and these types of diversity initiatives, and you know, it sort of feels a little bit abstract to their lives.
No one talks in agendas and
no
UN
one talks in
goals.
agenda and UN goals. Exactly right. And it's like, well, I hope all that stuff's happening, but it doesn't really relate to me. So getting it sort of percolated through to me and who I am and my life is really important. So honestly speaking, there's still quite a lot of jargon. It feels like that's a shortcut, and it can make us feel safe. You know, if we're wrapped in science, then that's obviously going to be believable. But unfortunately, it doesn't help get that message across.
So have the conversation at the water cooler.
Have it at the water cooler. Yeah, exactly right. An addendum to that point is actually around sustainability as a term, which I do have to sort of emphasise that it has just reached saturation point. It's kind of seen as a ticket to entry in conversation anyway nowadays. It doesn't have a lot of extra clout in it for consumers. So this sense of fatigue just around the word itself and causing people to shut off needs to be addressed too. So we just have to change into the type of language that consumers use. You know,
this blanket,
the world, their world.
Yeah, this blanket term of sustainability is just a little bit too esoteric now for consumers.
Correct, exactly. We've got a second principle called get off the stage. You know, a lot of brands feel it's important to own the debate. You know, to be up there and saying something meaningful and be sort of vociferous in that. But it can also look quite one-dimensional. It's just coming from our brand. And what we saw was if you can platform the many faces of good, give lots of people a voice, bring others into your conversation, meaningful partnerships, meaningful voices from your customers and your consumers as well, it actually drives that dialogue. So it actually helps with the previous point about the water cooler. Finding a why. We found that a lot of communications seem to finish with the what, but not tell anyone why it was happening. And that doesn't go far enough for people. They're actually needing us to be radically transparent. This is what we're doing, and we're doing it because of X reason, and this is why. You know, this is the why for you as well. So being specific, being absolutely candidly and radically specific about everything that you're doing is really important for customers.
I think you can even take that a step further. One of my favourite books, Start With Why by Simon Sinek, would argue that you can even go, this is why we are doing something. We believe in this. And so because we believe in this, this is what we're doing. And you even reverse the script further.
I need to build that into this, yeah. Good point.
All right, third principle, we're up to number 4.
Okay, rally a coalition of the willing. This is about putting your differences aside, really. So
I love this one.
Yeah, I really love this too, because there's nothing more powerful, right, than saying, hey, you know this guy that we never used to get on for one reason or another, actually because of this cause and because of how important we both believe this is, we've got together to solve it. And it could be more than one partner, it could be a sort of a tri-party, but you know, that idea of getting even your competitors together to solve a problem suggests that you've got the right intentions about good, that you are willing to sacrifice something and that you are willing to go that extra mile and actually use the power of togetherness. You know, going back to the me versus we and where people are at with the sense of community and doing things and that sort of amplification effect. People get that now. They really get that. So really consider how we can give the floor to others and bring other people.
I love that one. You know, I think in my mind, there's nothing more compelling than seeing two adjacent businesses, or even better yet, you know, the extreme example is you and your competitors coming together and putting your differences aside. Nothing says we are walking the talk more so than, you know, letting competitive dynamics wash away in the effort for good. And last but certainly not least.
Yeah, lastly, And this one feels obvious to some extent when we're talking about communications in Australia, but it's around humour. I've done thousands of group discussions in my life on advertising, and the funny ones always have much more cut through. You talk to people, what chats do you remember? And it seems like this Australian spirit that suddenly comes out of people when they're thinking about advertising communications. It's sort of endemic, or it's a way of thinking about our spirit and personality through the humour of comms. So if it's absent, it almost creates a little bit of a cognitive dissonance for people. And what we've seen a little bit for some brands, because this area feels difficult to navigate, again, you can sort of wander back into quite abstract or scientific language. And what we're saying is actually there's a role to just continue to be Australian and to use that sort of Aussie vernacular and that Aussie humour. And there's lots of different ways of doing that. It doesn't have to be real tongue-in-cheek or sort of laugh out loud. But there are examples of brands who probably just play a little bit more in that humour space anyway, who have been able to sort of crack through a little bit with that humour and balance both a message of seriousness with a message of sort of lightheartedness as well.
And I think that comes back to what you said at the very beginning, which is, first and foremost, you've got to be speaking in the tone of voice that is true and authentic to your brand. And so if you're a brand that has erred on the side of humour and humorous comms, why should the good that you do be any different? It can still be within that brand persona.
Yeah, correct.
All right, so we've got these 5. Have the conversation at the water cooler. Get off the stage. What's your why? What's your because? Rally a coalition of the willing. And humour helps, especially down under.
Great. Yeah.
Awesome.
Just thinking about all of those 5, we did find that there was also one meta principle that overarched everything, which I found really helpful. And it really seemed like the best performing ads deployed a little bit of a magic formula.
Okay.
And it essentially had 3 parts to it. So the first part was immediate proof. So when I talked earlier about, you have to be walking the walk, and you have to be, not scientific, but at least providing some sense of evidence and facts of the moment here and now, that's your ticket to play. That's the first entry point. So if we say something really quite obvious, it doesn't have to be groundbreaking about what we're doing or even what we've done in the past. That allows people to believe us. It's as simple as that. It gives credibility. That then allows us to then promise. So the next component was about creating some kind of a promise, not again into the future, but what we're going to be doing in the immediate term and how that promise is going to help you. Right, and how it's going to help our world. So we don't want that to be into the abstract or the long term, but it is a promise for now and a commitment. And then the third is participate. So actually, like I said, this conversation, be part of it. That's what our audiences sort of want. And the best performing comms actually ask people to be involved in some way or hold us to account. So not necessarily you having to do anything, but we're doing something and we'd love you to make sure that we do it as well. So the 3 Ps were proof, promise and participate.
Love it. I think that is some phenomenal guidance for brands, and I think, a really consumer-led and data-backed set of recommendations. So thank you for that. All right, as we wrap up, yet another illuminating conversation as always, AT. What are your 3 rules for brands looking to sustainably grow if they want to play in this space over the coming year?
Yeah. Well, look, firstly, we are now in pretty turbulent kind of times, and that's not going to change now ever. We are used to that. That is the new normal, inverted commas. So the question you've got to ask yourself is, what role does good play in that? And I think you've got 2 choices. You either sort of run away from it and say, okay, this is not the time for it, or you lean into it and you grasp the nettle. And so my first advice would be grasp the nettle, because now is absolutely the moment to make the most of this. Do you think you're going to make immediate profit out of good? Probably not. But what it does is it will act as this life raft for you in times of turbulence, which we are going to be increasingly in. It's like a shield. It sort of insulates the brand from shocks. And so if you really, really want to think about long-term value rather than just short-term hits, this is the place to be, to sort of looking for it from. And to corroborate that further, everything I said about Gen Z and this new generation, and actually whether they give you the time of day or not, now is predicated on this, let alone in 20 years' time. So get it wrong now, and we're not going to have any customers in the future. I think, secondly, good is very nuanced. It's very distributed, as we talked about the 7 forces, we talked about the model, we talked about the fact that sustainability is only 25% of the picture. So if you're only thinking green, you're missing 75% of the good that you can be doing and that your customers care about. And it differs. It differs across industries, it differs across generations, it differs across different types of brands. But it's a good start point to have a consistent picture of good that we've created, and then to say, well, what is the componentry of that for me, for my brand, and what's going to actually give us, the share that we deserve, and help us, guide us to do the things that we know that our customers actually want. Thinking about the 7 forces of good is the next kind of recommendation. And then lastly, just to recap on that, communications principles. I genuinely believe that this is the key to our future success as a nation, because at the moment, people don't really know what we're doing, and good begets good. So if we're doing good, which I know that a lot of brands and businesses are, but it's not getting through and we're speaking different languages and shouting loud is not the answer, we have to find a way to navigate that. So, for everybody who listens to your podcast, who would be in the business of communications, having that conversation, thinking about the principles, creating dialogue, being honest, having impact, being humble, avoiding jargon, just creating a really clear way of making sure that we're amplifying the good that we do is absolutely critical for the future.
Great. I love that. And I think you touched on, a really important point, which is you and I aren't here talking about good being the silver bullet for profit, right? Good is not necessarily, it may be for some, but not necessarily going to circumvent, the challenges that your business has to navigate. But what it absolutely will do, and you and I have spent an inordinate amount of time exploring and proving this, is provide resilience, and a way to insulate your brand against shocks to loyalty. All right, and then finally, a word on what this doesn't look like. For someone that might misinterpret, either selectively or not so selectively, what you've just said. What doesn't sustainable growth look like in this space?
Well, it's not we're not talking about shortcuts to relevancy with the generations that we talked about, or even with our customers. It's not something that we can hack. Good. It comes from a much deeper place, and I know that a lot of brands and businesses have thought really carefully about the good that they do, and how that manifests with their customers. But at the moment, we're entering into a time where our customers are going to be making ever increasingly difficult choices. So, like you said, good isn't just a shortcut to be preferred over another brand. In fact, it's probably not going to be in the short term. So we have to understand that trade-off better, which is probably the next chapter of this for you and me. But when we're just out of field with the choice model. The choice model has linked very specifically, clearly, trade-offs that our customers are making across different categories and different brands. We've mapped out all of the sort of the forces of good and the elements within them that might actually have an influence on people's decision making, and then ask them to trade those off against things that are really important to them, like price, for example. So we're going to know exactly how that dynamic works now. Not only that, we've also mapped it to real world transactions. So we not only know what people are doing in a sort of simulated sense, we know what they're doing in a real sense as well. So the combination of those two things I don't think has been done to this extent in Australia, and provides us with this really powerful kind of lens on customers as we're entering into a sort of phase where choices are going to be increasingly under scrutiny.
Fantastic. Well, look, I can't wait to unpack that with you as we come out of field and bring the next 3 phases to market. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me on The Growth Distillery. I look forward to bringing the next 3 phases of this program of work to market with you. For anyone that's listening or watching, if you want to know anything more about the program of work, reach out to either of us. We'd love to have a chat. We will chew your ears off as it pertains to this topic. But again, thank you. Appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you, Dan. It's great to be here.